Hello everyone, welcome back to Blockman editor tutorial. In these videos, we will give you a complete introduction to the Blockman editor. The game logic in the trigger editor is made up of both trigger nodes and action nodes. We've covered the contents related to trigger nodes in previous videos. Next, let's take a look at the action nodes. In this video, we will explain the common nodes related to entities in action nodes. Open the editor, click on the entity in the entity component, and open the trigger edit interface in the properties view. Let's first add a trigger node when the entity enters the game. Double-click on the execution port, and click on the entity node in the action node list to see the action nodes related to entities. Next, we will introduce a few commonly used entity nodes, and please try out the other entity nodes in your own time. The first node is the damage entity node. Its effect is to deduct the HP value of a specified entity. This node is mostly used to achieve the effect of dealing damage to an entity. The second node is the restore the entity's HP node. The effect of this node is to restore the HP of a specified entity. This node is commonly used to achieve the effect of restoring the HP of an entity. The third node is the kill entity node, which is used to cause the death of a specified entity. The fourth node is the respawn entity node. The effect of this node is to revive a dead entity. When using this node, we have to confirm the parameters such as the entity to be respawned, the map to be used for the respawn, and the exact coordinates of the respawn. The fifth node is the set the entity's coordinates node, which we generally use to achieve the effect of teleporting an entity. When using this node, we also need to confirm the parameters such as the entity to be teleported, the map used for the teleport, and the coordinates of the teleport. The sixth node is the set the entity's respawn point node, which we usually use to achieve the effect of recording save points. For example, in a Parker game, we would use this node to record the location of the entity, so that we can respawn them at the save point. The seventh node is the add buff to the entity node, and the remove buff by types node, which can be used together. For example, when we use these two nodes to design the game logic, we use them to give the entity a buff when it steps on the part, and then remove the buff when the entity leaves the surface of the part. Next, let's create a simple scenario with the entity's action nodes. The scenario's effects are, when the entity touches the rectangular part, it will lose HP, and when the entity leaves the rectangular part, it will stop losing HP. When an entity touches a cylindrical part, modify the entity's respawn point to the coordinates of the current cylindrical part. When a player falls into a trap, they will die. Let's start with creating the logic of damaging an entity. Enter the editor and in the prepared map, click on the rectangular part to open the trigger edit interface for the part. First, we have to set up the logic that allows the entity to lose HP when touching the part. The first step is to click the new button to create the when the part is touched by an entity trigger node. The second step is to double-click on the execution port, and select the add buff to the entity node in the entity action nodes. The third step is to set the entity parameter to the entity which touches the part in the current trigger parameters. The fourth step is to set the buff parameter to the prepared lose HP buff, and uncheck the limit the duration of the buff parameter. Next, we have to set the logic to remove the lose HP buff when the entity leaves the part. The first step is to click the add trigger button, and add the when an entity is leaving the surface of the part trigger node. The second step is to double-click the execution port, and select the remove buff by types node in the entity action nodes. The third step is to set the entity parameter to the entity that has left the surface of the part in the current trigger parameters. The fourth step is to set the buff parameters to the prepared lose HP buff. Now that the logic for an entity to lose HP when touching the part, stop losing HP when leaving the part, is completed. Next, let's make the logic for storing the entity respawn point. Click on the cylindrical part in the scene to open the trigger edit interface. The first step is to click the new button to create when the part is touched by an entity trigger node. The second step is to double-click on the execution port, and select the Set the Entity's Respawn Point node in the Entity Action nodes. The third step is to set the entity parameter to the entity which touches the part in the current trigger parameters. The fourth step is to set the map parameter to the obtain map by name node in map, and set the map 001 as the map. The fifth step is to set the respawn point parameter to the obtain the position of the part node in part, and set the part parameter to the touched part. This completes the logic for storing the entity's respawn points. Finally, let's make the logic that kills the entity after touching the trap parts. Click on the prepared trap part in the scene to open the trigger edit interface. The first step is to click the new button to create when the part is touched by an entity trigger node. The second step is to double-click the execution port and select the kill entity node in the entity action nodes. The third step is to set the entity parameter to the entity which touches the part in the current trigger parameters. This completes the logic of having the entity fall into the trap and dies. Now let's run the game and see the results. As you can see, the entity begins to lose HP after touching the rectangular part, and the losing HP stops when the entity leaves the part. This cylindrical part that the entity is touching now is the part where the respawn points are stored, and now we have stored the respawn points. Below this part is the trap part. When we fall down the trap, it will trigger the death of the entity trigger. Immediately afterward you will find that the entity is respawned at the respawn point we have set. That's all for this video. We hope it can help you on your way to a great creator. If you want to know more about the editor, you can comment below the video or post on the official forum. See you in the next video.